Marcus Jenkins, a high school senior, was brutally targeted and humiliated on the streets of Charleston simply for walking home, an act meant to be ordinary but turned into shocking injustice. Officer Brandon Holt, driven by arrogance and bias, attacked him without cause, using his badge as a shield for impunity. But fate shifted when Marcus's father, General David Jenkins, stepped in, bringing authority, action, and unwavering support that no one could ignore. Just wait to see how the community rallied. Justice was restored, and Marcus turned fear and pain into a powerful story of courage and triumph. It was one of those days in Charleston where the heat clung to the streets like a heavy blanket, making the sidewalks shimmer under the glaring sun. Marcus Jenkins, 17 and full of teenage energy, was finishing his last lap around the school gym before heading home. His backpack bounced lightly on his shoulder, and the rhythmic sound of his sneakers on the pavement mixed with the music spilling quietly from his earbuds. For Marcus, this walk home was supposed to be the simplest part of the day. A few minutes to himself, a chance to replay the basketball moves he had just practiced, and the comforting thought of sitting down to relax once he reached his block. The streets were unusually busy that afternoon. Families strolled along the sidewalks, small groups of friends laughed as they wandered past shops, and the distant rumble of traffic filled the air. Marcus's own group of friends trailed just a few steps behind him, joking about the latest basketball game, their voices bright and carefree. He didn't notice Officer Brandon Holt at first. Holt leaned slightly against the side of his patrol car, scanning the street with a tight-lipped expression that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than the afternoon sun. Marcus had seen him around before. He was known in the neighborhood for being quick to confront anyone he considered suspicious, and not always for fair reasons. As Marcus stepped closer, Holt's eyes locked onto him, narrowing in a way that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck prickle. "Hey, you there!" Holt called, his voice carrying over the chatter of the street. Marcus pulled out one earbud, startled. Yes, sir?" he said cautiously, trying to sound polite. Holt didn't bother with a calm explanation or question. He immediately accused Marcus of loitering suspiciously, though Marcus had been walking steadily the entire time, never stopping, never looking around furtively. Confusion turned quickly to fear. Marcus tried to explain, raising his hands slightly. "I'm just walking home from practice." He began, but Holt cut him off with a stern look that brooked no interruption. The officer's presence loomed over Marcus, a sudden reminder that sometimes authority could feel like an immovable wall. Marcus's friends rushed to his side, their voices overlapping, trying to calm the tension or argue on his behalf. But Holt's eyes didn't waver. There was a cold precision in the way he assessed Marcus, as if he had already decided the outcome before a single word was exchanged. And then, in a flash that seemed to slow in Marcus's mind, the officer moved closer, his hand raised. Marcus barely had time to flinch. The moment was over almost as soon as it began, yet it left a sharp, disorienting shock that seemed to echo across the street. His friends gasped, some frozen in disbelief, others taking a step back, unsure of what to do next. People nearby had stopped, their casual afternoon interrupted, their attention captured by the sudden, unmistakable tension in the air. The unfairness of the situation hit Marcus first, then his friends, then the small crowd gathering nearby. Here he was, a high school senior walking home after practice, doing nothing wrong, and yet he had been targeted, singled out, and confronted in a way that felt completely unprovoked. Anger surged like wildfire in his chest. How could someone entrusted with public safety treat a young person simply because of the way he looked, as if he were a threat? How could a uniform, a badge, and the authority they represented be used to intimidate instead of protect? Every fiber of Marcus's being felt the injustice. The raw emotion wasn't just fear or confusion, it was indignation. He had learned about fairness in school, about right and wrong, about accountability. And yet, here it was, being shattered before his eyes. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing. The incident left an imprint, a mixture of shock and righteous anger that would not fade quietly. It was a moment that demanded attention, that demanded acknowledgement, and it was the kind of moment that would change the way he saw the world, at least for a time. Even as his body tingled from the sudden encounter, Marcus knew one thing with absolute clarity. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was an injustice, clear and undeniable, and it had to be faced. The streets of Charleston might have seemed ordinary. The summer heat might have pressed down on everyone equally. But in that moment, Marcus understood how sharply reality could bite when prejudice and authority collided. And deep inside, a spark of determination began to flicker, small but unyielding, in the heart of a young man who had just been forced to confront anger in its rawest form. Marcus stumbled backward, the sudden impact leaving him momentarily dazed. His hand flew to his face, not fully understanding where the shock ended and the ache began. The pain radiated through his jaw and head, a sharp reminder of how quickly life could shift from normalcy to fear. But more than the physical sting, there was a weight pressing on his chest, a humbling, almost suffocating sense of humiliation. He had never imagined that simply walking home, following the routine he had done countless times, could end with such an intense feeling of powerlessness. His friends crowded around him, their concern palpable. They whispered among themselves, glancing at Holt and back at Marcus, their faces a mix of worry and disbelief. Some wanted to intervene, to shout or demand justice in that moment, but the sight of Holt, standing rigidly in his uniform, blocked every impulse. Authority, when misused, could feel absolute, like a wall that neither courage nor reason could penetrate. And in that moment, Marcus felt the harsh truth of that reality. Whispers began to ripple through the street as neighbors and passers-by noticed the commotion. The low murmur of concern and disbelief grew into a subtle chorus, carrying with it the weight of communal unease. Yet Holt remained unfazed. He straightened, adjusted his badge, and projected an air of invulnerability. There was a certainty in his demeanor, a cold arrogance that seemed to say the consequences would never touch him. In that certainty, Marcus felt a pang of despair. The system that existed to protect people like him, the law, the rules, the very authority meant to ensure fairness, suddenly seemed like a barrier to his own safety rather than a shield. Within minutes, Angela Jenkins, Marcus's mother, arrived. She had been alerted by frantic messages from neighbors and Marcus's friends. Her presence was immediate, fierce, and desperate, her voice trembling with both fear and outrage as she demanded an explanation. But even Angela, a woman known for her poise and resilience, felt the frustration of limits. Holt's uniform and badge created an invisible barrier she could not cross. The authority they symbolized made her words feel powerless. Marcus watched his mother, her fists clenched and her face flushed with anger, and a mix of admiration and helplessness stirred within him. He wanted to feel protected, to feel safe, yet even this natural refuge seemed unreachable. The following days carried the echoes of that moment. Each time Marcus touched his jaw, he felt the lingering pain, a reminder of vulnerability and of how easily control could be taken from him. But the discomfort extended far beyond the physical. In classrooms, at the basketball court, even on the streets, he sensed the subtle stares and the quiet murmurs, an awareness of what had happened that was impossible to ignore. It was a weight that pressed on his confidence, a humbling reminder that injustice often existed without immediate repercussion. Marcus tried to maintain his normal routine, but the emotional toll was relentless. Simple activities that had once brought him joy, shooting hoops, listening to music, joking with friends, now carried a shadow of tension. Every time he passed a police car or a uniformed officer, his heart clenched reflexively. Even small gestures, like walking through a familiar intersection or waving to a neighbor, now carried the memory of fear and humiliation. Yet beneath the ache, both physical and emotional, there was a quiet resilience beginning to form. Marcus felt the injustice keenly, and while it brought pain, it also planted the first seeds of determination. The system had faltered, leaving him vulnerable, but he was learning, slowly, that the human response to such moments could not only be survival, but the beginning of resistance. It was a lesson harshly taught, yet impossible to ignore. By the end of those first days, Marcus knew one undeniable truth. The humiliation, the helplessness, and the ache were not just obstacles. They were a signal. They were the spark of awareness, a call to confront what seemed insurmountable. And deep inside, even as his jaw throbbed and his spirit felt bruised, Marcus began to feel the faint glimmer of hope. A hope that would demand courage, clarity, and eventually action. The tension that had shadowed Marcus for days began to shift with the unexpected arrival of someone whose presence carried authority unlike anything he had ever encountered. General David Jenkins, Marcus's father, commanded the United States Marine Corps, a man whose reputation was built on discipline, integrity, and the unwavering ability to handle challenges with clarity and decisiveness. When Angela called him, her voice trembled with both urgency and desperation. David's response was immediate. There was no hesitation, no bureaucratic delay, only the unmistakable certainty of action. Marcus watched from the corner of the room as his mother explained the situation, her words spilling out in a mixture of frustration and fear. David listened carefully, his expression calm but focused, absorbing every detail of what had happened. In that moment, Marcus felt a flicker of relief he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. This was his father, the man whose presence alone could command respect in the most rigid halls of power, whose decisions could reach places Marcus had thought entirely out of his control. And now, that presence was directed at the very injustice that had shaken his world. The following hours moved with surprising speed. Investigators arrived, formally documenting every account, collecting statements, and preserving evidence. Marcus felt the weight of his father's attention as a shield, a protective force that seemed to push back against the helplessness that had clung to him for days. For the first time since the incident, he began to feel a cautious sense of optimism. The fear and humiliation that had seemed so permanent now appeared, at least partially, as obstacles that could be overcome. David's approach was methodical but firm. He made it clear that no one, no matter their position, could hide behind a title or a badge to escape accountability. Holt's previous confidence, his arrogance of assumed impunity, began to crumble under the careful scrutiny of federal oversight. Marcus observed this quietly, a mix of awe and relief stirring within him. The man who had seemed untouchable just days before was now facing the unyielding structure of justice, and Marcus realized, perhaps for the first time, that systems could be leveraged to protect, not just to oppress. Beyond the procedural shifts, there was another change, an emotional one. Marcus felt the invisible weight on his shoulders lift, replaced by a growing conviction that he was not alone. His father's unwavering presence communicated something that went beyond legal or procedural remedies. It was a message of trust and support, that Marcus's experiences, his pain, and his dignity mattered. In a world that had seemed indifferent, this affirmation offered a sense of safety and validation that Marcus had desperately needed. With each phone call, each carefully coordinated step, Marcus's hope solidified. He could sense that Holt's actions were no longer a private affront to him. They were now subject to oversight, scrutiny, and the unflinching attention of someone whose career and life had been dedicated to structure, discipline, and fairness. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Where fear and despair had dominated, a sense of potential resolution began to take hold. Even in quiet moments, walking down the hall at home, sitting on the porch in the evening, or preparing for the next day of school, Marcus felt a renewed focus. The hope he carried was not naive. It was grounded in the tangible reality of action being taken. He understood that justice might still require time, persistence, and resilience. But for the first time since that afternoon on the street, the outcome no longer seemed entirely out of his control. By the end of the first week, Marcus's sense of despair had been replaced with a cautious but growing optimism. The fear that had shadowed him was slowly giving way to an inner strength he hadn't yet realized he possessed. With his father's guidance and protection, the boy who had felt utterly powerless was beginning to reclaim both confidence and courage. Hope, once a fragile ember, now burned steadily, signaling that even in moments of injustice there was a path forward, a way to confront wrongdoing, and a promise that support and accountability could restore balance. The tension that had gripped Marcus for days finally began to lift. News came slowly at first. Officer Brandon Holt had been suspended pending investigation, a move that felt both procedural and symbolic. But the turning point arrived when formal charges of misconduct and assault were filed. The relief was tangible, yet what made the moment extraordinary was not just the legal accountability. It was the message it sent to the entire community. No one, regardless of title or position, could act above the law with impunity. This realization resonated not only with Marcus, but with every person who had witnessed, directly or indirectly, the injustice he had endured. The local community, once shaken into quiet concern, now rallied with visible energy and unity. Neighbors, friends, and even classmates gathered around Marcus and his family, offering support, encouragement, and a shared sense of triumph. Flowers were left at the steps of their home, notes of encouragement lined his locker at school, and small acts of solidarity reminded Marcus that he was never truly alone. It was a collective acknowledgement that integrity and courage mattered, and that standing up against wrongdoing could inspire real change. The atmosphere, once heavy with tension and fear, now carried a palpable sense of empowerment. School administrators recognized Marcus's experience not as a private struggle, but as a lesson for the wider student body. An assembly was organized, bringing together students, faculty, and members of the community. Marcus stood at the podium, his heart racing, but his resolve steady. He looked out over the crowd and saw familiar faces, the friends who had walked home with him that day, their eyes wide with empathy, teachers who had silently supported him, neighbors who had been watching from a distance. Each face reflected a mixture of curiosity, concern, and pride. Marcus began to speak, recounting the ordeal with clarity and courage. He did not dwell on anger or pain alone. He spoke of resilience, of the moments when fear threatened to overwhelm him, and the quiet strength that allowed him to keep moving forward. His voice carried the weight of experience, but also the hope that had grown steadily since that first day. With each word, he transformed the incident from a personal struggle into a story of collective strength and the triumph of accountability. Tears glimmered in the eyes of listeners, some slipping quietly down cheeks as the emotional resonance of Marcus's journey became undeniable. The assembly was more than a recounting of events. It was a celebration of courage in the face of adversity, a testament to the idea that standing up for oneself is never a solitary act. The crowd's response was a mixture of relief, pride, and affirmation, a communal recognition that injustice, when confronted, can be overcome. Even after the assembly ended, the impact lingered. Holt's suspension and pending charges represented more than punishment. They symbolized the restoration of balance and the affirmation that integrity could not be ignored. Marcus's experience became a touchstone for the community, a story shared in classrooms, local gatherings, and family conversations. People saw in his journey a reflection of the values that mattered most: courage, truth, and the power of family support. For Marcus, the triumph was deeply personal, but also shared. He realized that the darkest moments, when confronted with courage and integrity, could be transformed into sources of inspiration. The support of his father, the rallying of his community, and the acknowledgement of his own resilience coalesced into a lesson he would carry for life: that even in moments of fear and uncertainty, standing firm in the truth could illuminate a path toward justice. By the time the evening sun settled over Charleston, casting a golden light across the streets, Marcus felt a profound sense of closure. Holt's actions had consequences, but more importantly, Marcus had emerged stronger, wiser, and inspired. His story was not merely one of personal victory. It was a beacon showing that courage, family, and moral clarity could turn moments of injustice into triumphs that reverberate far beyond a single life. In confronting the wrong, he had not only reclaimed his own dignity, but had inspired others to believe in the enduring power of standing together against what is unjust.